Welcome to Profit Led, a podcast by and for bootstrapped founders brave or crazy enough to grow a business to profitability with very few resources. Profit Led is brought to you by eWebinar, the leading automated webinar platform built to save you from doing the same webinar over and over again, from sales demos to customer onboarding to training. This season, Profit Led's host Melissa Kwan, who is also co-founder and CEO of eWebinar, will walk you step by step through the company's journey to $1 million. Melissa is a 3-time bootstrapper who has spent 13 years building startups. Together with co-host and eWebinar COO Todd Parmley, they will dive into one major topic per episode, sharing war stories, mistakes, and lessons learned as they grew the company to $1 million in annual recurring revenue 36 months after product launch. So buckle up, fellow bootstrappers. It's gonna be one heck of a ride.
Welcome to Profit Led, where we talk about our journey to $1 million at eWebinar, bootstrapping the company from day one. Our goal is to give you a window into what it's like to build a company with very little resources. Each episode goes in depth into one major aspect of our journey. We share war stories, mistakes, and lessons learned as we grew the company to $1 million in annual recurring revenue over 36 months. My name is Melissa Kwan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of eWebinar and your host. I'm here with my co-host today, Todd Parmley, eWebinar's COO. Hey, Todd, how's it going?
I'm good. It's very cold in Brooklyn today, and we're on opposite ends of the earth.
Yeah, but very hot in your apartment.
Yes, right. It's the tale as old as time in New York. You have steam heat. It's just boiling hot and like 30 degrees outside. Fahrenheit.
It's one of those old building things, I guess, right? For some context for people who don't really know about New York.
Right. I mean, our building's 120 years old, something.
So I used to live in a 5-bedroom, 2-level brownstone in New York, and it had I guess it was a similar system. It was like steam, right?
Yeah.
And then it would make all sorts of noise, but there was no way to control. Even if you turned it off, it was still on. And so our room would also be boiling, but downstairs would be freezing cold because it was such open space.
That's what's happening right now in my apartment.
You know, in the last episode, we talked about recruiting a top 1% CTO co-founder, the mindset of that person, and what you should look to offer beyond equity to get that person on board, how to keep them engaged and interested so they don't hop on the next opportunity. We also said a lot of nice things about David, and we have yet to get him to listen to that episode.
I still think it should be his birthday present.
When he gets mad, we'll have him listen to that episode, I think, which is the next company meeting. So today on episode 6, we're going to talk about how we took eWebinar from idea to product launch. This is actually your specialty. So by title, we refer Todd as our COO, but really he's the jack of all trades operations guy. And he was also the first person that I went to when I decided to start eWebinar to help do competitive research and write the first version of our website. So Todd, let's start from the beginning. When I came to you to help me on eWebinar, you weren't super convinced yet, but you wanted to help because we were friends. I think you were curious, but not totally convinced on this being a viable business. I wanted you to help me write the website, which is really hard to do when you have no product and no customers. And so you offered first to do some competitive research, which would have been important to come up with that, first set of content. So can you share the process you went through to do that research? What were you looking for? And, how did you decide which companies to include in that comparison?
It's funny. I don't know that I just didn't quite get the idea. I understood it in principle, but I couldn't really grasp the idea of an automated webinar and how that would be better. I had the same kind of prejudices that our customers often come to us with, which is how could it be better than live? How is this different from a video? All of those questions. And so, when I was asked to do the content for the website and also this competitive research, I remember, by the way, I went back and I looked at the document. I was like, what was this research? And I started on April 18th, 2019, and the doc is dated April 22nd. So it was literally the first thing I did.
Yeah. So we incorporated the company, I think first week of March.
Oh yeah. This is and we met in March to first talk about this. I guess it was my first day. We'd already talked about it. It was my first day working on anything related to eWebinar. It was April 22nd. So I looked at about 25 webinar companies, but it was more than webinar companies. It was virtual meeting companies, the so-called automated webinar products, but it was, large platforms like Zoom and then even like YouTube, because we were looking at like, not only were we looking at automated webinar software that was already kind of in that category, but we were looking at things that people were using to solve the problem of training people or doing demos over and over again, whether they were doing them live, which was actually the norm, or those that might be doing pre-recorded. So I think the list was like, many of them came from you, and then I added to it. And it was pretty high level. Like I didn't dig in too deep. It was like, what are they? What main features do they offer? Who are their customers? How much do they cost? That kind of thing, right? I just wanted to get a sense of the landscape and also like the general feature set of webinar type products. So then I kind of dove into the automated webinar software products a little bit more. So that was like signing up for the trial, actually using the product a little bit, because, not only was I trying to validate the idea, I was trying to understand the idea. Like I was trying to get it. I was trying to have like the moment where I was like, okay, I understand why eWebinar is going to be so much better than what's already out there. So I did actually use those products to experience what they were like. That was sort of the scope of the research that I did.
Like, where did you draw the line, like for things you weren't going to use, right? Because you don't want to spend endless months doing this research. If we were going to list everything, including training software, live and automated, like it would just take forever. So like, how did you decide, okay, this is where I'm going to stop?
I mean, it was not a scientific process by any means. It was like, we don't need to know. I mean, because at the end of the day, these products are all pretty similar. When you look at, Zoom and Big Marker and Livestorm or whatever you're looking at, there's a certain, you stop learning things after a minute because that group of products are so similar. So it was sort of like until it had diminishing returns, which was quick, right? So, and I only looked at a few, I only really looked at YouTube as a straight up streaming platform. There was no need to look at Vimeo too or anything like that. It was just like, for people who are just putting videos on YouTube to solve this problem, what are they doing? In my experience, you actually don't need to do too much research before you stop learning. And the second you stop learning, you stop researching.
And what were some of the things that you wrote down? Right. So now you're like, okay, these are the companies I'm going to research. Like you looked at the document. So like, what were some of the things you took note of so that you could come back to it later?
I mean, honestly, I really quickly moved on to the automated category because I was really trying to understand. So I focused on those. And there's very few that like hybrid platforms or whatever you want to call them, those that support both live webinars and pre-recorded webinars. First of all, pre-recorded is it's not even automated. It's just like Zoom. You do a live webinar, it will record it, and then you can share the recording after. And that's their automated so-called webinar feature, right? It's just a video. So in terms of understanding where our place would be in the marketplace, it didn't make sense to spend much time looking at those products. So I looked at, the usual suspects of automated platforms out there. And, quickly learned that, one of the biggest surprises is that they were super scammy. Like they were built to trick people into thinking that a webinar was live when it wasn't. And not only that, they were built to emulate a live webinar. Like they didn't even stop to think like, wait, if this is an automated experience, right? And we're not trying to hide that it's live or that it's pre-recorded, how can you actually take advantage of those? They hadn't even thought of that. They hadn't even opened up that question. So that was kind of the surprise.
What was going through your mind though, when you were learning about all this stuff? Like outside of like, okay, this is scammy, right? Were you also trying to convince yourself, this is the company I want to continue working with? Like, how did that mindset change from like our first conversation to after this report?
First of all, I really did immediately see the opportunity. First of all, because the options out there were so crappy. So even if you were going to build a better mousetrap, that was something. I kind of got it, right? I was like, oh, I understand what an automated webinar is. I understand what its value is. And once I understood sort of the base concept, then all the ideas that you had that were kind of your vision to make it better, suddenly I could also envision those and think, oh, wow, this is a significantly better experience. Like this is a leap. So that's when I started to get excited about the idea.
I mean, you talk about a better mousetrap, and I've written about this on LinkedIn quite a bit, on like blue ocean versus red ocean opportunity versus purple ocean. Like what eWebinar is really purple ocean, right? Which is taking an existing business model that works and applying it to a different vertical. In my previous two startups, they were both blue ocean. We created something for a market that didn't exist, and both companies were very hard, long sales cycles, stuff like that. But with eWebinar, like I made sure that I was not going to choose another blue ocean opportunity. So, and I really felt how much easier it was, like while we were doing this research, right? There's like nothing better to validate an idea than to know that another business is doing something similar. And, there's this, I think, misconception that, a better mousetrap is just a better mousetrap. It's not just a better mousetrap, right? Like it means that there is a group of people that see value in the problem that you're solving. And not every product can get, in fact, like products can't have 100% of the market. Like I'd encourage people that are listening to think like, you don't have to do something that no one's ever seen before. In fact, like if you are a bootstrap company, you should do something that people can compare to. Even now, like when we're like, how do we build this feature? We're like, oh, let's see how someone else did it. We make it better. And I'm sure people do that with us.
Of course. Everyone does. That's part of building software. I think too that the idea of building a better mousetrap sort of implies that you're just making little tweaks, right? You're just going to change something here and change something there, when really what you're saying is like, no, this is a different mousetrap. It's better, but it is a different mousetrap.
And I was that different mouse, right? Because I lived this problem for 5 years and I tried everything out there because I genuinely wanted to solve that problem of doing live webinars over and over again, because I was doing that for my last startup. And the fact that I didn't find something made me realize there was this gap that someone needed to fill. And the moment I asked myself, okay, how would I feel if someone else did it? After thinking about it for 5 years, I immediately registered the company. Like I couldn't stand the thought that like someone else would have solved this the way that I wanted to. I know we're kind of getting a bit off track here.
Well, just let me add one more comment about like, I can't remember when we started using this term, but like the Netflix of webinars, that really was like, oh, of course. Like, why is this webinar thing still like in a kind of sanctum, like it's sacrosanct, it has to be live. Meanwhile, everything else we're looking at is streaming on demand, everything. And so it's like, why not translate that to the webinar space? So that was another big moment, was like, of course this needs to be done.
I would think like really just if you look at all communication, there are so few things that are live now. I think like calling your mom and live webinars are like the only two things that are live, right? Like we text our family and friends all day long because we're so busy, we can't hop on the phone. We see a phone call, we end it and we say, can you just text me? I'm busy, but I'm like pretending to be busy, right? Like Loom was created to be asynchronous communication, to cut down meetings, right? Like, people record videos, to each other, whether it's on Slack or on their phone, to communicate something asynchronously. It was just so weird that like live webinars, people feel like I must do this live or else, like no one's going to think I'm authentic. It's so weird. And like, there's no TV outside of like New Year's countdown and like games, right? Like sports.
Right. It has to be a very special event, like a live concert or something like that, to merit like the importance of watching it live. But one more thing I'll add and then we can move on. But just like the idea of an asynchronous event was also very exciting to me, because video is captured time. So people can experience the same event at 1,000 different times by watching the same video. So then how do you create other elements that you add on to that timeline that make it so that it's a full event, right? It's not just watching a video. So that idea was also super exciting to me.
And guess who's doing that? TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, right? Like you're watching those video events and seeing comments and reactions come up, and you know that it's synced to the time in the video, and you know someone watched it yesterday, even a month ago, but you're totally fine with that. It's just so weird.
It's like comments on SoundCloud. It's like the same thing.
It's a shared experience on the video or music timeline. that is asynchronous. It just hasn't, I guess, been transferred to business. I guess that's how I was trying to explain it before you actually looked at any of these products.
Because it was more than just bringing it to webinars. It was bringing it to the business world. So anyway.
I guess that's the blue ocean thing, right? Like we wanted to sell it to like small, medium-sized businesses, maybe large businesses, but start, somewhere. So the next step, I guess, was we took this research and we used it, or we wanted to use it to spec our version 1. So at this point, we still hadn't really thought about what was our product going to be. And, I kind of thought about it. So I knew in my head, when we first started to brainstorm ideas on eWebinar, what I wanted it to look like. But I didn't even know actually that you were a product manager. I think I just kind of lucked out on that one.
You didn't know that about me?
No, I just knew you worked at Corcoran and then you worked at some other startups and that you did stuff. The thing I knew though was that you signed off on my contract when I was selling you in my last startup. So that's how we met. But because you were thinking about the product in a more technical and organized manner, and I just wanted features that I thought were important. And the thing is, by that time in my last startup, I had tried everything under the sun to help me deliver these demos and trainings on autopilot. So I knew the solutions that were out there. I knew the limitations. And I knew that I only wanted 3 specific things. And I communicated those to you and I was like, can you just make this into something? So the first was I wanted it to be beautiful and professional because none of the things I looked at were like Apple standard. I wanted this to be the Apple of webinars. I wanted someone to be in this experience and feel delighted enough that they would look it up and sign up on their own. Everything out there was just super dated and horrible. And I did use some of those products in my past to try to solve my problem, but I was always a bit embarrassed to use those products because I spent so much time making the product in my last startup beautiful. And then when it came to the training, it didn't match my product, but I also couldn't run that many trainings. So I was always a little bit embarrassed about being associated with subpar software. And so the second thing was I wanted an interactive experience to make that to make attendees feel engaged because I've run so many webinars, people drop off halfway. I've attended webinars that I get bored. So I wanted things to be beautiful and pop up throughout. And I wanted to give attendees something to do so they don't play with their phone and be on Instagram. I mean, I think we're all guilty of that. And not just the typical polls and offers that you see in normal, I guess, regular webinar software. I wanted to have the widest range of interactive elements that were out there. And then we ended up calling those interactions. And then most importantly, the third thing that I wanted to have in this system was I wanted a chat system that worked like support. And that was really the thing that was missing from all the other software that prevented me from truly running all my trainings and demos on autopilot. Was all these other software had an email box or no chat, or they had a chat, but you had to be there live. So it was the video was automated, but then the chat wasn't automated, wasn't asynchronous. So then I still had to be there. And it just kind of defeated the purpose of fully automating your workflow. And so I wanted the ability, just like Intercom. It wasn't a big ask. It existed to be able to hop in and respond in real time during an automated session or respond later by email if the attendee's not there. So all the support chat systems were already doing that. So I wanted intercom style chat attached to a video experience that would start at a certain time, like a webinar. And so that's all I told you. And you went out and created an entire spec of what that version 1 would look like. So can you talk through that process of how you did that and how you determined what was required and what wasn't in that V1?
First of all, it was a lot of fun. I was like a kid in a candy store. I was really excited about it. And we were working with a great designer with the dev team that we were working with in Canada. So that was just a super fun collaborative experience. But basically, the first place I started was the competitors. So this is more like a product migration, something I have had a lot of experience with, where you're trying to move people from one existing product to a new product. So you really, unless you hit a minimum threshold of the core features that they need in order to make the switch, then they can't switch. So if we wanted to make money from day one, we needed to have kind of this minimum number of features that would make that possible. It's very, very different mindset than building a product from scratch that's completely new. A lot of time was spent just documenting features in existing products and lining them up against each other. And it became really clear what were the quote unquote standard features, right? You had things like all of them have reminder and follow-up emails. All of them have some type of landing page. All of them have some type of analytics, whether it's very, very basic or whatever. So you end up with those kind of standard features. And by the way, standard features doesn't mean that you don't innovate on them, because it's really obvious to see, and it was really obvious to see where some of these standard features were ridiculously outdated. Just to give one example, it's like this was the standard for almost all landing pages, is that you would fill out like a form with everything you wanted to appear on the page, but you couldn't actually see what the page would look like. In a lot of cases, you actually had to finish the entire webinar creation process and publish the webinar before you could even see what your landing page looked like. So there were already obvious ways in which we could innovate on the standard features, right? So that was that. And then the next thing was, okay, you as a subject matter expert who's lived this problem for so long, who has a vision of how to make it better, then you look at those and you say, okay, here's the list of those features, the core ones you listed, but what are the actual implications of implementing them? What will they actually look like? And you kind of combine those things together. And it's like this big ass backlog. It's giant, right? It's intimidating. And I know that there are product managers and engineers out there who are cringing right now because this sounds like the waterfall approach. But that is the reality of a product migration. I don't know if that's the right term for it. It's always what I called it. It's like you're moving to it. You're getting people to migrate from one product to another product. That means you have to be able to launch with a fully functioning piece of software with all the features that people kind of quote unquote expect to be there. That was kind of like the broad process. And that sounds like I said, a lot of people are like, oh my God, that's horrible. You're going to make so many mistakes. Like you have no idea what you're doing. You're going to build this behemoth.
But what's the other way of the right way of doing it? Why would someone listen to this and be like, oh, that's,
Well, because I think there's this sort of this incredibly intense dogmatic doctrine about product development now that has to do with you just build it in the minimum viable product. And it's like, well, yeah, but this is not that. We couldn't just launch with a webinar room. We couldn't. No one would pay us for that. So you have to take a different approach. And there is risk with that. But there's also an advantage. When you can take time to look at what's out there, it's very rare that you get to develop a master plan for a product.
I mean, it's also how people define MVP, right? My MVP has always been the minimal viable product that someone would pay for, which is not, minimal viable product that was defined, by the lean startup 12 years ago, however long that was, right? It was just a different world. I actually recently listened to a podcast by Eric Ries, who wrote The Lean Startup. I think he was on Lenny or some big podcast. And even he was like, I wrote that book so long ago and everything has changed. Consumer expectations being, one of those things. And actually, I saw this pretty funny, LinkedIn meme last week. It was a completely burnt pizza, burnt to a crisp. And it was launch my MVP, there's no market for this. But you get that, right? It's just people are, oh yeah, threw a landing page out there, nobody signed up, or gave them this really crappy product, nobody used it, no market.
Well, yeah. And if you're bootstrapped, you're not putting together a proof of concept for VCs or something, right? You're no, this actually has to work. And it actually needs to solve a fairly complex problem that has multiple aspects to it.
And we actually also wanted to be innovative. I just remembered this, is we actively looked at peripheral products that were not webinar, because we're okay, if I want this to be Netflix, right? What do I look at? If I wanted to deliver a brand new video consumption experience that is interactive and fun, what are consumers, not business users, what are consumers looking at? So we challenged ourselves because once we were looking at all the webinar software, we're why are all these the same? How you create the calendar, how you edit the notifications, how you, create the first event, it's all the same. And it's actually all the same in a bad way. If one company had a terrible experience, you could tell who else copied them. And that actually became a bit obvious, right? So we were like, okay, if we were to start from scratch, because we are not a webinar software, we are a video software. So all of these companies, what we call live first. So they're like a Zoom or a Livestorm, and then they might have, an on-demand feature, but it's not their entire product. We wanted on-demand and recurring webinars as our primary and only product. We are not going to do live. So we have to approach this differently. And if we want to be something people have never seen, we can't just take inspiration from things that exist. So we actually went to look at all the TV apps. We looked at video editing software. We looked at Twitch. Like, how do people watch games? We looked at Instagram Live, Facebook Live, how the emotions came up and how they log different comments and all those things, right? So we were trying to think outside the box.
I think one of our most innovative features, which is not innovative at all in the video editing space, is the ability to just drop elements on a video timeline. You move the scrubber, the playhead to a certain spot, and you add an element. Like, that is just basic video editing. But in a webinar context, it was like, oh my God, this is a 1,000 times better and easier than what exists now.
Yeah. And like, none of the other products, you could not just see the landing page, you couldn't see the whole experience without leaving it or joining as an attendee. And we wanted to make an experience where you always knew exactly what that was going to look like. So our entire experience was even now you kind of edit in line. So you're never guessing, like you're not jumping from like creation to preview all the time. Like, what you are creating is the preview the whole time. And I don't think that exists. I mean, that goes back to David, right? Like he was like, yeah, we could just do this. We're like, yeah, cool. Is that possible in a browser? I mean, in my last startup, one of the things that I learned when like you're dissecting competitive solutions was features are always there for a reason. You might not understand them right away, but you always come to understand later because your customers start asking for them. Meaning, like, you could be looking at a competitor solution thinking, oh yeah, that feature is so stupid. Like, why is it there? I'm going to ignore it. But then after you launch, a customer will ask for it because of a use case that you don't know about. Like, you had just learned. You're like now learning how people use it. So what I've taken from that experience is actually to not discount anything that I see. And if I don't understand it yet, I'm just going to write it down for later.
For sure. I mean, and also I think it's really important to kind of talk about how copying is not easy. You're going to mess it up. Like, I remember I worked for a company where, they were hyper focused on copying a specific competitor product. And, this was before I got there. And when I got there, I started looking at it and it looked like it had little like vestigial tails all over. I was like, what does that even do? Like, why is it designed that way? It makes no sense. So when I went back and looked at the source product and kind of really dug into it, they had made, a bunch of design decisions, at least, that were there for a completely different reason that they hadn't really understood. And so, copying is not easy, right? So we were trying to copy some things. So you can't just copy blindly. You definitely can't. You have to understand or do your best to understand the intention or the reason behind it. And if you don't, because you won't, you will miss things. You'll find out later. There were definitely features. There still are definitely features that we were like, that is so dumb. Like, that makes no sense, that we have since implemented, or some version of that, like our version of that.
And I think sometimes even if you like understanding it also means you can choose not to do it. An example is like we integrate with a bunch of CRMs and it's like how they're tagged or something like that, or how they go into a CRM is a certain way and we built it differently. So like we know our product is more flexible, but it's also more technical. So when people are coming in from other products, they just don't understand it. Or like there were certain leads that were tagged by default a certain way. And we're like, why would they do that? And like now we're going back to be like, oh, okay, that's why. That's because they're using it in their business in this way. People are always like, well, I think VCs love saying this. Well, can't someone just go and copy that? Well, yeah. Like if you give someone enough time and resource, they can copy a Facebook, copy an Instagram, but you don't know the nuances of why things are built a certain way. I can guarantee if someone looks at our product, they can copy it, but there are so many little things we do that are not visible. That just makes the software so much more user-friendly that they're never going to be able to copy.
I mean, I actually think that's one of our biggest competitive advantages now, is that like we think so deeply about the idea of like a pre-recorded asynchronous event or whatever you want to call it in the webinar space. And that is just baked into our product. It's baked into like the DNA of the product. And so you can go look at our features and sure, there's tons that you can copy, but A, you're going to miss the intention of a lot of features. And B, you're just not thinking about the product in the same way. You're just not because you're copying. So it's just very hard. I kind of want to go back for a minute because we never really finished answering the question, like, how did we end up with our first backlog, which was, because I just want to mention this one thing, which was, okay, we put together this, I mentioned we put together this big list, but then I don't know if you remember this. Of course you do. We met in this, like, you were visiting New York with David. You were in some like fancy new development building in West Chelsea, I think. And
I rented it from another nomad.
That's right. I remember that. And we met in the lobby and with this beautiful big lobby. And we did basically what's called a card sorting exercise, which is basically we go through and we say, this one is in and this one is out. But there was still a really long list.
I mean, we prioritized them, I think, with like, I don't know if it was like a 1 to 5 or like there was some sort of priority system that was like must have, nice to have. And we just worked off of that. In fact, some of those things are still sitting in the wish list. Some of those things that we thought were version 1 important are actually after 4 years still in our backlog. So it's completely normal. I mean, do you remember like we tried our best, like even after that first exercise to keep the product small and it was just like taking forever to build because we still had too many features and that were like must haves. I mean, we incorporated, as I mentioned in March 2019, and we onboarded the first customer on trial July 2020. So that was like 15, 16 months. We charged our first customer September 2020. Like we gave the first set of customers 60-day trial instead of like 30, which we eventually lowered to 14, but that's another conversation. I remember David was so frustrated because it was taking so long that, to build this thing, and it was never good enough, that he never saw the light at the end of the tunnel. And we ended up near the end, I guess, meeting every week or every 2 weeks near the end for the sole purpose of cutting things down so we can speed things up. Do you remember what that process was like?
Hey, I'd like to take a second here to talk about my own company, eWebinar, and our mission to rescue people from what I call webinar hell by saving you literally hundreds of hours every month through webinar automation. eWebinar was designed to take a pre-recorded video and turn it into an interactive, automated webinar that is more engaging than a live webinar by almost any metric you choose. Attendance rates are higher, watch times are higher, engagement is higher, and conversion rates are higher. eWebinar lets you do hundreds of webinars without ever needing to be there to host them live and without sacrificing a personal touch. So if your sales team is tired of doing the same demo over and over for unqualified leads or worse, prospects who don't even show up, an on-demand demo powered by eWebinar can help them get their time back so they can close more deals. If you're doing customer onboarding and training on repeat, eWebinar can help you automate those sessions so you never have to do them live again. Customer success teams are using eWebinar to run hundreds of webinars every single month without a live host. Why don't you give our product a try and see for yourself? Visit ewebinar.com to join our own on-demand demo or to sign up for a free trial. All right, now that I've gotten that out of my system, let's get back to the episode.
I mean, this kind of thing definitely is.
It was mostly me saying everything was important and you saying, no, it's not.
Yeah, there was that dynamic, which is a very common dynamic between a product person and a CEO. There were kind of two ideas driving it, I think. And that actually is a really healthy thing in the product development process, to have push-pull between CEO, product, and engineering. Engineering saying, like, that is going to take us 12 years to build, or, whatever that is. But there's a natural push-pull. That's healthy collaboration. Collaboration does not mean agreement, folks. It means working together to figure out the best path forward. But there were two main ideas driving us, right? One was coming mostly from me and one was coming from you. And the thing I had my eye on the most was this idea of like a minimum marketable product, which I think is pretty close to your idea. But the way I was thinking of it was, we needed to launch with a product that could be marketed as a full-fledged product in the webinar space, and more particularly in the automated webinar space. We needed to be able to credibly say, like, this belongs in this category, And it has enough of quote unquote feature parity, which didn't need to be exact, that someone who is currently using another product could make the switch, knowing that they might have to sacrifice some bells and whistles, but that what they were gaining was so much better that those little details didn't matter. So we could skimp on some of what the other products had, provided we were offering something new that was so compelling that it was like, oh my God, yes. And, that was also the idea, was let's take some new customers along for a ride and learn from them, which we were actively communicating to people at the beginning. We were like, tell us what's preventing you from using the product. Tell us what's, so that's what I was looking at. When do we have a minimum marketable product in this category? And then the second idea, the second thing that was driving us was coming from you, which was sort of your idea of an MVP, which you sort of already mentioned a little bit of, but why don't you sort of explain what that point of view was?
I just want to touch on what you just said there, because Jason Lemkin, who is the godfather of SaaS, founder of SaaStr, if you don't know SaaStr or Jason Lemkin, you can just quit now. Basically, he's came up with this idea, or he wrote something before, of why every company needs a 10 times feature. And what you just said is a 10 times feature. So you guys can look that up. It's a feature that for a material number of customers and prospects wins the deal versus the competition, period. Not always, but often. And as a startup, you do not need feature parity. You need a 10 times feature that you are gaining so much from that 10 times feature that everything else is okay, right? You can miss those things. And for us, we decided that was chat, because it was so obvious that it was hard to build and no one had it. And that was something that, people would immediately be able to understand that, oh, this is they would not be able to try our product and something else and be like, oh, that one has a chat, but it's not good. They don't even have it.
Yeah, right. It doesn't even exist. What I would just add to that is that I think people, when they're trying to create a competitive product, focus on feature parity, right? They focus on getting to feature parity. And there is some truth to that. You have to hit some sort of minimum threshold, but that threshold is way lower than you think it is if you have the 10x feature.
Well, I think there's a minimum feature parity.
Yeah, minimum feature parity, right? And that's where your minimum viable product is in the minimum feature parity. But is there something else? If you only have minimum feature parity, is there something else that's going to compel people to say, I want that over this?
Well, you have to have it. Why else would someone come over? Because the other product's better than you. It's been in the market for 10 more years than you, right? Of course they're gonna be better than you. Right. And I think chasing feature parity, especially coming out with that first version, is very dangerous, right? Because you are not serving the same customer and you don't know why those features are there. That's the danger. You're building all this stuff, like the past company you were talking about. You're building all this stuff, wasting all this time, delaying your time to market, but you don't know why it's there. And now you've got this bloated thing that, makes it kind of confusing, right? So coming back to what my idea of an MVP is, it's always been very clear to me, because I'm in sales, that an MVP is the minimal viable product that someone would pay for. They don't say they will pay for it. They will pay for it. They are putting their credit card in. And a lot of my friends would be like, oh, I've got customers. I'm like, are they paying you? It's not a customer if they're not paying you. Everybody, especially your friends, will tell you your idea is amazing, your product's amazing. The moment you ask them to pay $10 for it, they'll tell you everything that's wrong with it and why they will not pay for it. It's so hard to go from free to paid. I've tried to do that in the past with my previous companies. We're talking beta and alpha products, right? The reason why I was so adamant about not having a free product or freemium or, beta, or to let people see it, was because I know that when you put a person who's supposed to critique a product in front of something, that's all they're going to do. Because that's what beta users are. Right? Your first users, I'm going to test this on you and, secretly I'm going to convert you. That's just not going to happen. It's so hard, right? It's a peanut gallery. It was so important because we're bootstrapped. I'm spending my own money. So I need to generate revenue from day one. And actually, David was super frustrated about that, because he was like, why can't we put this out? We have the website, we have the product, get people to try it. And the thing is, I have sold enterprise for 10 years up to that point. I know what companies are not going to pay for.
They're not going to pay for something they can't use right away. That doesn't create value right away. So I want to say that we probably spent an extra 6 months just putting in like the last 10% and really pushing the team to deliver on what I thought someone would pay for, because I'm going out to sell it. So I can't close the deal if I won't even pay for it. And I was actually at that point still working for Spacio. So Spacio was going to be the first, like, HomeSpotter who bought my company was going to be the first customer.
I remember it was a huge learning experience for me too, because, I've always thought that a good product manager needs to think like an entrepreneur and connect features to revenue. But I'd never really thought about it in the sense of a feature that you can sell. Like, you're literally sitting in front of someone and talking to them, and you're trying to convince them why they should switch. What are you going to point to? So between my ideas of what we were trying to get to and between your ideas of what we're trying to get to, we became really laser focused at the end. It's like we had these little litmus tests. It was like, does it pass the test or does it not pass the test? And if it didn't pass the test, we cut it from scope. And it still took us that extra 6 months, but we dumped a lot. In spite of the fact that it took us longer, we got rid of a lot too. So I think we got really good at the end.
I mean, the thing is, I was going to put this in front of HomeSpotter customers. Like, I can't screw it up. This thing has to work, right? Like, it can't look bad. Like, we're representing a brand that I'm still a part of, right? Because I got permission from my CEO to work on this company. And you're right. Like, when I heard you say, okay, I want to, my MVP is something that I can market. Well, you can market something that doesn't sell. The number one, like, job for a CEO is to make sure you never run out of money. The only way to do that is to make sure you make money. So yeah, so I always, when I say I'm a revenue-driven and profit-driven founder, like, that is what I'm thinking about, is like, what's my sales pitch? How do I close? Right? What are the features that are like, if you have this, you are going to get X amount of value. And if you partner with me, I'm not going to let you down because this is a solid piece of software that works. I was going to sell this to my customers that I still had, right? Like real estate brokerages and also some of my real estate tech buddies. And I have a reputation to keep up because Spacio was also a piece of software that was beautiful, worked really well. People were impressed with it. So I had that reputation I wanted to upkeep. So if I gave them a janky piece of software to train their customers and team, it's not going to make me look good. So my MVP was something like the minimal product that someone will start paying for from day one. And I really thought about it as like, would I pay for it? And by doing that, we actually converted over 85% of the first batch of trial users. So I think from July and, all the way to September 2020, all I was doing, ironically, was calls, like live calls, live demos, talking to people, getting them onboarded. And we'll talk about that in the later episodes. And we'll also dive into, how we got our first customers and, when we talk about founder-led sales. But that was how, like, having my MVP is actually how we got, probably I would say, like the first year's worth of customers.
And, I also think it's really telling that it took us, so you did all those live calls, right? So you were learning what sold the product. You were learning what worked and what didn't in the context of a sales demo. And then, but very quickly, we started using our own product to demo our own product, which was like this revolutionary idea in the webinar space. It was like, you go to any webinar software, website, and you either have to book a demo or you watch a video. And it's like, wait a minute, especially in the automated space, it's like, It makes no sense. So I think it's really telling that we were able to use our own product to accomplish what we had set out to accomplish, because we were able to do that very, very quickly. So, that's probably a good place to wrap up. Yeah,
I think so. We're going to definitely dive into what happened after launching the product in the later episode.
There's definitely more to the story. So just to, again, summarize what we talked about today, we talked about the idea, primarily the process that I went to sort of validate the idea of what eWebinar in the current sort of competitive landscape, what we went through, the process of speccing out V1 of the product, and then how we trimmed and cut that big backlog down to size to get us to launch? And then finally, how did we decide we were ready for launch, right? When were we ready to put this out into the world so that people would actually pay for it from day one? That's sort of a summary of everything we talked about today. So with all that in mind, what is your hot take for today?
So my hot take is bootstrap companies have no choice but to generate revenue from day one. It's very, very hard to go from free to paid. So just remember that. Like, that's my advice. I'm sure, every business is very different. Whether you're B2B or B2C is also different, but I'm only B2B and I sell to other companies and I've only built business products. So that's my experience. Just remember that as you're speccing and thinking about what you're launching with, and you don't always get a second chance at selling. That was the other thing I was thinking about is like, I can't talk to these companies 3 times. Right? Like, I have one chance to talk to them and they're going to come on or not. So really think about like the product that you can actually go and sell from day one and try to make it as small as possible. But also know that sometimes you have to make hard decisions as to like what to cut.
My hot take is just a little bit of a kind of variation on that, which is just thinking about it more because this is something you do at the very ground level where the rubber meets the road. You are literally sorting what features you're going to do and not do. And so to have very clear ideas of what qualifies a feature as staying or going before your launch will help you stay laser focused. Like, you won't get kind of, distracted by shiny object syndrome, right? And be like, oh, wow, but this would be cool. But is it going to make money? Is it going to actually convince someone? And by the way, that doesn't mean it can't, like, can you, and also just to your point, can you sell it? Because will it help the story? That could qualify a feature also. It's just that it helps bolster your story of what you're doing. So that's sort of my hot take. Do it literally on a day-to-day basis as you're deciding what to do and not do.
Yeah. And there's something that just came to mind that I forgot to mention is like the way that we apply MVP to a product is the same way we apply this philosophy to our website, our branding, our experience. It's not just build a feature that works really well. Like, we spent 4 months designing the website, the brand, like every single icon and every single page. We had like 50 or 60 pages of the app before we even had the first line of code, right? We probably spent like $50,000, $60,000 just on that. So like, I remember wanting, like, I told, you and David, like, it was so important for someone to look at this company and feel like it's grown up. The only thing we have, like our storefront, is the website. So how do we make people feel like we're a MailChimp, but we don't have any customers? It's like I equate it to like renovating or, a restaurant without any customers, or, like, people, if it's a beautiful restaurant with a nice vibe, nice lighting, people are going to at least try it. And that's what we wanted people to do, was at least listen to me and try it. So the MVP is not just a software thing. It's also like a branding and, website and all that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And messaging, all of it. Yeah, I agree 100%.
So if there are particular topics that you want us to get into this season, please let me know by connecting with me on LinkedIn. Or if you have any feedback about this podcast, I'd love to hear from you. My name is Melissa Kwan. My last name is spelled Kwan. And if what we've talked about today resonates with you, subscribe to Profit Led on your favorite podcast app to get notified of new episodes, and join our mailing list by going to profitled.fm. I promise to only share things you'll actually care about. Thanks for listening to this episode.
Thanks for listening to Profit Led. If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you will subscribe to the Profit Led podcast and head over to our website, profitled.fm, to see the show notes of every episode. You can also join our mailing list to be notified of new episodes or when we have interesting products and resources to share. We promise to only share things you'll actually care about. Thanks again for listening. Bye now.